debt ceiling. And yesterday they voted to move forward on a debt ceiling bill. That failed in the Senate. It had been introduced by Majority Leader Harry Reid. It would have raised the debt limit through the end of next year. It needed 60 votes, only got 53. Live coverage now from the floor of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Lord God of all creative possibilities, help our lawmakers turn this impasse into a bypass so that the heart of our nation may beat vibrantly and strong. Lord, on our coins and currency, we have placed the words, "In God we trust." Give our lawmakers the wisdom to trust you and each other, turning the stubbornness of impossibilities into the blessings of creative possibilities. You are our God, and we refuse to entertain fears about our nation's future, for we remember how you have led this great republic in the past. Make a way out of no way. Answer our prayers and use your powerful arms to keep our nation safe and secure. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., October 13, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Heidi Heitkamp, a senator from the state of North Dakota, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
President.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to count number 211, the debt ceiling bill.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 211, S-1569, a bill to ensure the complete and timely payment of the obligations of the United States government until December 31st, 2014.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
We're going to have some speakers throughout today's session. Has the clerk reported the title of the bill? Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention that I should.
The clerk has reported.
Okay. We have speakers throughout this day's session. Senators are permitted to speak up for 10 minutes each. And we'll have more information at a subsequent time as to how late we'll be in. Madam President, yesterday Republicans voted to stop the Senate from even debating legislation to avert a catastrophic default on the nation's debt. They stopped this body from even discussing the single most important issue facing this nation, the loss of the full faith and credit of our great country. And they did so under the pretext that refusing to pay the country's bills would somehow make those bills disappear. No one denies that this nation has work to do to reduce its debt. But Republicans say this country should default on its debt today. They're the same Republicans who ran up the debt just a few short years ago. These same Republicans charged more than $4 trillion in tax breaks for the rich on the American taxpayer's credit card. They paid for 2 wars, costing about $2 trillion with borrowed money. And they rang up $400 billion tab for a Medicare prescription drug plan. And, Madam President, they ran up the nation's credit card for years and years on lots of stuff. Now, Madam President, there was one conversation on one of the Sunday shows today that said we were trying to break the cap set in the Budget Act. And we know that on January 15th, that's the second year of sequestration. Well, Madam President, we voted differently than that. We voted to extend the CR to November 15th, not a word about breaking the caps. We're happy to go forward in the CR, as we've already voted for in this body. So any talk about breaking the caps is not anything that came from us. So, yet every single Republican refused yesterday to even talk about paying the bill now that it's due. Madam President, the presiding officer and everyone in this body knows, and I think the American people know, that I met yesterday with Senator McConnell. We're in conversation today. I'm confident the Republicans will allow the government to open and extend the ability of this country to pay its bills. And I'm going to do everything that I can throughout the day to accomplish just this. It's important that we do this, that we must do this. It's the height of hypocrisy to not pay our bills, height of irresponsibility. Americans want Congress to compromise. They want Congress to give economic certainty and security, not more indecision and doubt. Americans want Congress to do its job. That's all they're asking us to do. Americans want Congress to reopen the government, take the threat of default off the table, and sit down to talk about a long-term budget deal that creates jobs and strengthens the middle class. And I'm confident and hopeful that will be accomplished.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, senators are permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. The Majority Whip.
Madam President. Madam President, I want to thank the Majority Leader for his statement, and we're hoping that there will be positive developments today and very quickly relative to the impasse which we have reached. It is time to reopen this government. It's time to make certain that we pay our bills, and then let us engage an honest debate on the issues that are before us, and there are many. The forum for that debate, I think, is very obvious. It's the budget conference, the conference between the two budget committees. The Senate Budget Committee, chaired by Senator Patty Murray of Washington, passed a budget on the floor of the Senate 6 months ago. Senator Murray and others on our side have tried on 21 separate occasions to ask for unanimous consent to go to this budget conference committee to start debating the issues which we now see in the press every day. 21 separate times the Republicans have objected to even meeting. That's unfortunate, and it is one of the reasons we're here today. It is hard to believe, if you're in the midst of this maelstrom, that not even 2 weeks have passed since we started this debate on the floor of the Senate, which has led to this terrible situation. 2 weeks ago, our government was open. There was a good thinking, or at least a good hope, that we were going to extend the debt ceiling of the United States. Now we're in a much different place. We are just 2 days away from the second week ending of a full government shutdown, a government shutdown which has furloughed some 800,000 employees. Well, that's an unfortunate situation for these employees and their families, but for the American people as well. What the House Republicans have learned, and those Senate Republicans supporting them, is that this government shutdown has real-world consequences. I can remember taking my kids to Chuck E. Cheese and watching this whack-a-mole game where something would pop up and you'd hit it with a hammer. That is what the House Republicans have been doing on a daily basis. If a story comes out that suggests that people are being denied critical medical care at the National Institutes of Health, they say, we'll reopen that part of government. If a story comes out, tragic stories, that families who've lost a loved one in service to this country are not receiving the benefits they're entitled to, they'll pass an exception to the budget. The VA, the same thing. FEMA, the same way. It's no way to run a government, and it's unfair to the American people. Their strategy, as convoluted as it is they will pass these bills one at a time to fund our government until it gets down to a handful of bills for agencies they just don't care for. One of the agencies that the right-wing spokespeople have identified that they want to close down, the Environmental Protection Agency. They want to close down the Environmental Protection Agency. That's an outrageous statement. You may disagree with the policy of that agency. I disagree with some myself. But when it comes down to its important mission to make sure that we have safe drinking water and air that is not going to create public health hazards, I hope it's something that most people, regardless of their political background, would agree is an important government function. But this strategy of a piecemeal appropriation has resulted in an embarrassing predicament for our government. People laid off cannot go to work. Basic services cannot be provided. The other day, a Republican senator came to the floor and said, well, let's at least agree that we should open FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Natural disasters do occur, and so he made a motion to open that agency. I asked him, I said, wouldn't you want to also open the Weather Service to make sure they're fully staffed to warn people before a disaster occurs? Wouldn't you also want to make sure that the agencies that arrive on the scene of disasters, like the Small Business Agency, to try to get businesses back in place, should also be reopened? Shouldn't the Coast Guard be fully funded to make sure that if there's need for rescue, they are present? Well, he reflected on it and said, yes, let's include all those. That's the problem with picking and choosing agencies. You're going to miss something critically important. That's what we faced. Secondly, on this debt ceiling, as awful as it is to face a shutdown in government, for the United States to default on its national debt for the first time in history would be catastrophic. That isn't my word. It's a word given to us by the Business Roundtable. The leaders of the major businesses in the United States have said if we default on our debt for the first time, it will be catastrophic. October 17th, Thursday, is the day. If we haven't taken action by then, we risk default. Yesterday, we tried to pass what we call a clean extension of the debt ceiling. No political strings attached. Just extend it until the end of next year. All we asked our Republican colleagues to do was to allow us to bring this measure to the floor for debate, for amendment. Not one single Republican senator, not one, would vote to allow us to even proceed to the bill so that we could start the debate and in a timely way to respond to this challenge of the expiration of our debt ceiling Wednesday night. Well, if you listen to the business leaders across America, they will tell you that there's a lot at stake. This is not just another political issue. Since World War II, the United States has worked, effectively worked, to make the United States dollar the soundest currency in the world. Think about that. That U.S. dollar is the investment of choice of governments all around the world. They believe the safest place to be is in U.S. treasuries. And why? Because the United States always pays its debts, period. Now, the House Republicans and other Republicans have said, maybe we won't pay all our debts. Maybe we'll go into something called prioritization. Pick and choose the debts you want to pay. Well, many of us tried that when we were young and in college, and it catches up with you. After a while, you find out you just can't do that. Now put yourself in the position of a great nation, a nation that has to make $50 to $80 million a month, 50 to 80 million decisions a month, I should say, as to how they will pay the debts that are owed by the U.S. government. How will you prioritize them? The Republicans, many of them argue, will first start by paying our largest creditors. In other words, pay China first. Well, how soon then will we pay Social Security recipients, those waiting for veterans checks, those waiting for paychecks in our military, those who are owed money from our government, the transfers to states and localities that are critical for the ongoing operations of their government and their own credit rating? It is a ridiculous idea. It reminds me of Soviet revisionism when it comes to history, when they talk about how simple it will be to prioritize and to default on our debt. It will not. It'll be disastrous. And the flat earth economists who are preaching this don't have a leg to stand on. Economists and business leaders, many of whom are conservative Republicans, have warned the Republicans, don't do this. This is something that will cause damage for a long time to come. In threat of default in 2012, interest rates on 4-week Treasury bills tripled and are at the highest level since October of 2008. Fidelity Investments, the largest U.S. money market mutual fund, liquidated all of their short-term Treasury bills just on the threat of default on our debt. Well, is this default or is this debt ceiling extension something extraordinary? The honest answer is no. We've done it so routinely that most people haven't noticed. Congress has increased the debt ceiling 78 times since 1960, 49 times under Republican presidents, 29 times under Democrats. The debt was increased by 189% under President Ronald Reagan, 189% increase in the debt, compared to a little over 40% under President Obama. Debt ceiling increases have often been paired with other issues, but only recently has the threat of default been used as a bargaining chip. I know that if we fail to extend this debt ceiling, it will be catastrophic. A lot of people will suffer. I think about families, working families, with their savings accounts, perhaps their retirement accounts. Imagine, if you will, what it means to them to lose 5, 10% of the value of their savings. They work hard. Many of them barely scrape by, just getting by paycheck to paycheck, put a little money away for the future. And now, because of political gamesmanship on Capitol Hill, their hard-earned savings are at stake. That is the height of irresponsibility. That is the height of recklessness. The fact that we couldn't get one Republican vote yesterday to go forward on this is as troubling as anything that's happened on the floor of the Senate that I can remember. This is something we should all agree on to move forward on. I'm hopeful that these discussions between Senator Reid, the Democratic Majority Leader, and Senator McConnell, the Republican Leader, will bear fruit. I hope that they can find a sensible common ground to spare us of what we face. I hope we can end this government shutdown, pay our bills, and then engage in a meaningful, regular order, honest debate in our budget conference over many of the other issues that challenge us as a nation. That is what we were elected to do. That's what we must do. And those who are arguing that we need to continue this confrontation and take it to a high noon scenario, frankly, it's not very courageous on their part. It is pretty easy to be politically courageous with other people's money. And that's what's happening with those Republicans who are arguing that we should default on our national debt. They're playing with the savings of working families across America. That isn't fair to these families. We ought to stand by them, push for economic growth, creation of jobs, and not what this will do, damage this nation's recovery. I yield the floor.
The Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, over the last few days there's been a lot of talk about negotiating, and there's been a lot of negotiating, and that's good. Various senators in small and large groups have been talking about how long Various senators in small and large groups have been talking about how long a continuing resolution should be in effect, how much to extend the debt limit, among other issues. And surely it is important that negotiations take place. We Democrats have tried over 20 times now to move to a House-Senate conference so that we can discuss and can negotiate our differences on a budget resolution, but regrettably, Republicans have refused to allow those negotiations to occur. But the underlying issue, Madam President, is this: whether while negotiations are underway, our government should be open and serving the American people. Democrats believe government should be functioning during negotiations. For that matter, we believe because government performs important duties, it should always be opening and functioning. And while those negotiations are underway, we surely should not have the threat of a global economic meltdown hanging over our nation. The American people don't want the government to be shut down or for the United States to default on its obligations while negotiations take place or at any other time for that matter. No one knows how long negotiations will take. In the meantime, there are real hardships being imposed on the American people because of the shutdown. Vital public services are being impaired across all of government. nutrition assistance for women and children, Head Start programs for school children, research grants at the National Science Foundation, badly needed repairs to our highways, bridges, among other hundreds of other programs. Now, I think all of us agree that negotiations are more than desirable. They are essential. But the issue looming before us is not that. It's whether the government will be open and the threat of default will be lifted while we negotiate. Negotiations could last a while, so they should take place while the government is functioning. It is unconscionable that Americans are denied services and benefits while we negotiate. It is also unacceptable that those negotiations take place when one side has placed a bomb on the negotiating table and set the timer. Let me put it this way. If in the future I came to my Republican colleagues and said that as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I'm not going to allow the defense bill to come out of the committee until the Senate raises taxes on the wealthiest 1% of Americans, something I very much favor. Well, what would be the result? They would reject my ultimatum, and rightly so. Threats to do immense damage unless I get my way on an issue are plainly the wrong way to legislate and to get things done. Such threats just push people to dig in deeper on their positions. The shutdown of our government is doing tremendous damage. We know the American people have suffered great harm because of the government shutdown, and we know the impact on our economy and the world economy would be severe if we default on our debt. Who in this Congress believes that the government should remain closed while we negotiate? Who in this Congress believes that the government should remain closed while we negotiate? Who in this Congress believes that a default on our obligations is not damaging? Surely no more than a handful among us. And cutting through all the fog and cutting through the talk of the talking heads is this point, which I believe is unassailable. There's a lot of differences in negotiations. People have different positions on different issues. But I believe this is an unassailable and undebatable point. The vast majority of the American people believe that while negotiations are going on, the government should be functioning and that we should not default on our obligations. Sitting down together and discussing the many issues that our nation faces is essential, but it is also essential that we do so while the government is open and functioning and serving the American people. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
I appreciate all of the speeches that are being given, and all of them have a seed of possibility, but evidently we're not going to water them or try and grow them. We're just going to talk about possibilities. And there's enough blame to go around. It isn't just on one side. But I like to remind people of why we're here, hoping that we won't be here again. The reason that we're here is we didn't do the appropriations bills the way we're supposed to. Now, I know that we had a budget process, and the budget process got bogged down between the House and the Senate. But obviously, we have gotten past that problem, because I noticed that on the calendar that we have a whole bunch of appropriations bills. I think actually all 12 of them that we're supposed to pass. And the first one, I think, went on June 27th. So obviously they didn't feel constrained by not having a budget that was agreed to by the House and the Senate. They set some parameters and came up with bills, so we're past that budget argument that there was no conference committee. I thought there should be a conference committee. There wasn't a conference committee. And while we're talking about conference committees, I have to mention that the last offer from the House that we voted on in regard to this shutdown was a request by the House to have a conference committee made up of the Senate and the House to work out these problems before the shutdown went on this long. And the Democrats voted against that unanimously. It seems to me like if they want a conference committee on a budget that was supposed to be done April 15th, but that we've bypassed and done the appropriations for already, that's kind of a weak argument for saying now that there shouldn't be a conference regarding all of these issues that are coming up right now. I don't know how you get this resolved without getting the two sides talking. Neither side can solve the problem in the Senate without some help from the other side. It's going to take 60 votes, and that means that neither side has the clear majority that's necessary to pass it. The cloture vote that we voted on yesterday, that was to fix the credit cards of the federal government indefinitely with no limits for another year through 2015. That amounted to $1 1/10 trillion of estimated additional debt for the country, for our kids and our grandkids. Well, I used to talk a lot about our grandkids, and I moved it up to kids. Now I'm talking about us. We're finally the ones that are at risk, and that should certainly make all of the seniors interested. But we went to the White House the other day, and the President did a marvelous job of going through a speech and then questions and answers. And I was very disappointed at the end, because the end speech was, give me what I want for the shutdown in government, give me what I want for the debt limit increase, and then we can talk. The reason we're talking is because we have the government shutdown and we have this looming debt ceiling problem. There ought to be other ways that we can talk, but we don't. And so, like I say, there's plenty of blame to go around. This comment about we shouldn't do it piecemeal, and that's a reference to the different things that the House has sent over in regard to problems the Senate said was that we were having, problems that people immediately recognized. And every one of those, none of those have been voted on. None of them have been voted on. Maybe they weren't that much of a crisis. I think we all agreed they were that much of a crisis. But the answer is always, let's not do it piecemeal. Do you know why the appropriations process has 12 separate budgets, 12 separate spending bills? It's so that we do it piecemeal, so that we can look at them with some depth and maybe get some clarity out of the spending that we're doing. When we wind up doing an omnibus bill, and that's where we're headed, everything will be grouped into one and it'll be passed for the rest of the year, we won't get to look at any details. We won't get to make any amendments to it. We won't get to say what's effective and what isn't. And we'll just keep doing what we've been doing, which is running up the national debt. We can't afford to keep doing that. I talked about the national parks being a problem. I specifically talked about the national parks that are revenue producers and how we shouldn't shut down the businesses that produce the revenue. Well, I think in response to that, the states were allowed to take over national parks, but at their own expense, not from the revenue that would be generated by the park. And that creates some complications for Yellowstone Park, because Yellowstone Park is shared by 3 states. They did that specifically so Wyoming couldn't claim that Yellowstone was Wyoming's national park. So a little bit of it goes into Montana and a little bit of it goes into Idaho. And so it would require a joint agreement by the 3 states on exactly how that would work. And I'm hoping that those 3 states are working out a plan for if this ever happens again. That's one of the things government ought to do, is look at what the future possibilities are and say, no, we're never going to have a shutdown, we're never going to have a debt ceiling crisis. We create those crises. We create them by putting definite deadlines on things, and then everything crescendos up to that point, and any of the people that are picked for the task force have a huge media listening group, and that's disincentive actually to get it solved before the deadline. The National Institutes of Health was mentioned as a problem that needed to be solved. Armed forces who are on active duty training, veterans benefits, particularly veterans benefits for the year, compensation for furloughed federal employees, special nutrition programs, Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, continuing appropriations for Head Start, and salaries and related expenses of certain federal employees. Traditionally, when we've had a situation like this, when the employees do come back to work, they get compensated for the time that they weren't there. You know what the people in my state think of that? How come we're paying people for not working? So the principle behind that was to go ahead and approve their salaries and expenses and get them all back to work. And that would take care of most of the problems. But then the people wouldn't be feeling the hurt out there. And if they don't feel the hurt, they don't know who to blame. And if they can blame one side or the other, then that makes a difference in elections. That's not what this body's about. We should be about getting things done in the regular order, following the right spending process, which we don't do, and avoiding situations where we make it hurt. We've got a sequester that's in effect. It's the first time that the federal appropriations, the federal spending has actually been cut probably since the Korean War. But it was a true cut. But it was a 2 3/10% cut. Now, you won't find anybody agreeing that it was really 2 3/10%, even though that's what the law says. And that's because we didn't do our spending process in the proper order. And so we got through 8 months before the sequester went into effect. And when it goes into effect with only 4 months left, the 2 3/10% of the whole year's spending has to be taken out of the 4 months' worth of budget. That made it 5 3/10%. But let me tell you about another interesting effect. I got visited by the Head Start folks from my state, and they showed me what was going to happen if the sequester stayed in place. And it was kind of fascinating because they were cut 7.5% and are projected to be cut 7.5% each year after this. Well, if we did the appropriations, the spending process at the beginning of the year, it'd be 2 3/10%. And we should anticipate that it's going to be done that way for the future. So they should have been told to watch for 2 3/10% cuts. 5 3/10% for last year for the 4 months that they knew about it, although we knew about it for a whole year in advance, just didn't imagine that it would ever happen. So why 7.5%? What I have to believe, and from other spending things that I've seen by the people from Wyoming coming to Washington and telling me their dilemma, I think that the Washington bureaucracy is holding on to an overproportion of the money to keep their jobs in place instead of out there where the kids are. 7.5%, when it should be 5 3/10%, tells me that they kept 2 2/10% for running Washington. I don't think they think that that's a very important part of the spending process out there. And the paper's been covering a number of things that people are having trouble with. One of them is a fellow that went into the rum-making business. And you can do that legally, and there are certain requirements that you have to meet. And now he can't sell the rum. And I thought, well, sure, his formula hasn't been approved, or there hasn't been an inspection of the premises, or something disastrous like that. No, he can't do it because the FDA hasn't approved the labels. I didn't even know we had a law that said that Washington had to approve labels on liquor. I know that we used to have one that said that there were labels that had to go on cigarettes, but that didn't even require a Senate and House or administrative or FDA approval. It just required it. But evidently, if you're making rum, you have to have somebody approve your labels. And I think I did run into that before and questioned it. But we don't have to be in this position. We could have the government running, people could be paid, but we need to do it through the regular process. We need to do 12 spending bills and do them over a period of at least a week each and have amendments to it. There isn't an appropriator that's the ultimate answer for any spending bill. There isn't even a committee that's the ultimate answer for each spending bill. The reason that we have 100 people here and 435 people over there is so that we have 535 opinions on what could be unintended consequences or what is important or what isn't important. And if they are denied the right for amendments, they are being denied the right to voice for their constituents. It's not for us, it's for our constituents. And that's why amendments are important. We've had bills that have come up here and we've worked on them for maybe 3 weeks with no votes on amendments, while they tried to negotiate for a limited number of amendments. Okay. I appreciate that. I yield the floor. Thank you.
Senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, my colleague, our good friend from Wyoming, has talked about the need to get back to regular order so that we can discuss our funding priorities. And the fact of the matter is, of course, we agree, and the regular order would be to go to conference on the budget, which the Senate passed way back in March. And on a regular basis, the Democrats in the Senate have requested unanimous consent to go to conference on that budget. In fact, only a few days ago, we put in our 21st request for a unanimous consent to go to conference on our budget so that we can go to regular order and discuss and debate the priorities that are so important to all of us. And every single time, a Republican senator has objected to that request. Madam President, like so many of my Democratic colleagues have been doing, I come to the floor again today to discuss the urgent need to end the shutdown and raise the debt ceiling. There can no longer be any doubt that the shutdown is hurting hundreds of thousands of families and businesses throughout our country. I and many of my colleagues have told the stories of these families and businesses and will continue to do so. This shutdown hurts real people in real places all across our country. Keeping government running should not be a partisan battle. Yet, the Republicans who caused the shutdown in the first place seem to think that they'd be doing Democrats a favor by reopening government so that people can get back to work, get paid, and pay their bills. The idea that Congress should simply do its job isn't a favor to Democrats. It's our responsibility to the American people. The idea that stopping Congress from doing its job is somehow a valuable bargaining chip is incomprehensible to most people. Since the beginning of the shutdown, driven by an extreme faction of the Republican Party, people of all walks of life in Hawaii have contacted me. They've shared stories about the impact of the shutdown on their businesses, their families, and their communities. I've talked about the toll of the shutdown on our federal employees. I've shared stories from small businesses impacted by the closure of our national parks and other attractions. I've also been in contact with Hawaii's business community, our military, our state and local government, and others. Today, I'd like to share some more shutdown stories and also underscore that allowing the U.S. to default on paying our bills would only serve to make things much, much worse. One woman wrote to me, "My husband and I are both federal employees with the Forest Service. We both work in wildland fire. I am currently furloughed and he is working, but of course, neither of us will receive a paycheck. We have 3 children, ages 5, 3, and 1. My current daycare costs are $2,300 a month. I can't stop paying for daycare because all require a 2 to 4 week notice, and I would lose our spot for when I do go back to work. We have savings, but the money is what we have saved for things like Christmas and a special vacation together since my husband was gone for several months this summer fighting fires. This shutdown is extremely stressful for me, and I'm very concerned that it is going to go on for several weeks more." The Hawaii Chamber of Commerce, representing over 1,000 Hawaii businesses of all sizes, also sent me stories from some of their members. The president of one business wrote, "60% of our business is with the Department of Defense. We move military household goods around the world as they are restationed. As a direct result of the government shutdown, we've just had to lay off 41 of our 80 employees until this is resolved and the government starts booking moves. We informed the affected employees that all our staff will be working reduced hours. We anticipate that each day of this shutdown is costing the company over $18,000. Another business owner wrote, "My business is working on opening a 4th location in Aikahi Park Shopping Center. I was advised by our banker that SBA loan approvals and execution may be held up due to this debacle in D.C. He goes on, "How is that helping to move our economy forward? If we ran our business the way our leaders on Capitol Hill run our country, well, the close for business sign would not be far behind." Madam President, these are stories about things that are happening now as a result of the shutdown. If the U.S. were to fail to pay our bills, things would be much worse. Interest rates would skyrocket, our capital markets could freeze, and our nation's borrowing costs over the long term would require more of our federal budget. In other words, a default would end up costing our economy and consumers billions of dollars. Our country has never defaulted before. The consequences of such a default are so serious that everyone from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the National Association of Manufacturers have warned the Republicans in particular to avoid such a catastrophe. Even the uncertainty over a possible default is enough to hurt middle-class families and businesses. For example, after the last manufactured fiscal fiasco in 2011, mortgage interest rates rose. If you were a family looking to refinance or buy a new home, your mortgage would have cost you $100 per month more after the U.S. nearly defaulted than it would have cost you before. That means $100 less for families across the country to spend on groceries, gas, and other things. For most working people, $100 means a lot. Imagine piling another $100 a month or more on the family with 3 young children I mentioned earlier. We can't do that to them or other families like them. And remember, in 2011, we didn't default. The uncertainty alone caused mortgage interest rates to rise. Things would have been much worse if there had been a default. And yet, here we are again. It's incomprehensible that there are default deniers among my colleagues who refuse to believe that default will be catastrophic for all of us when we have the 2011 experience staring us in the face. A default would be like an immediate tax on everything that middle-class families do. If interest rates explode, the cost of living in Hawaii and everywhere else would rise. Student loan rates would go up. That'll reduce access to a quality education for many people. Credit cards, car payments, mortgages, all of these will become more expensive. The cost of doing business will go up. The cost of borrowing money to start or keep businesses going will go up. There is not a single good thing that will come from our country defaulting on paying its debts. As I've mentioned in past remarks, a government shutdown doesn't give businesses a pause in meeting their commitments. They still have to make rent, they still have to maintain staff, they still have to pay to keep the lights on. Imagine if the cost of all these things suddenly went up and still nothing was coming in. That's exactly where many businesses would find themselves if the U.S. defaults. In addition, with our economy still recovering from the economic crisis of 2008, finally we have businesses contemplating growing, and those plans will likely be put on hold or abandoned altogether. We should be growing jobs, strengthening the middle class, creating opportunities for our families and businesses. A default crisis would do exactly the opposite. In day 12 of the shutdown, and with a potential default looming on the horizon, it is way past time to give our families, businesses, and communities certainty and security. We need to open government and avoid a totally manufactured catastrophe. Let's get on with it. Well, I'm disappointed that our Republican colleagues yesterday failed to support going forward to do just that. I ask them to reconsider their position so that we can find a path that protects our families, our communities, and our economy. I yield the floor.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to follow up on the words of my distinguished colleague from Hawaii and also comment on a few points that the senator from Wyoming, Senator Enzi, made in this important debate that's happening in Washington today, and actually a debate that's happening all over our country. First, I want to associate myself with the effort underway by Senator Collins from Maine and Senator Cloture from Minnesota, Senator Pryor from Arkansas, and others on both sides of the aisles that have been working throughout the evening, the night, early morning hours, talking, trying to find a way forward. I thank both Leader Reid and Leader McConnell for blessing that effort and trying to find a way forward, because as the senator from Hawaii said, this is a very, very dangerous situation. And despite the fact that there are members on the other side of the Capitol in the Republican Party, not in the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party, that continue to doubt that there will be any ramifications from default, I hate to say it, but they're going to be sorry they uttered those words. This is a very, very serious situation. The U.S. Treasury bond is the safest investment in the world today. Let me repeat, the safest investment in the world today. Think about it. If you had a little bit of money, and would you invest it in Russia? Would you invest it in Saudi Arabia? Would you invest it in China? Where would you invest it? Now, the government of the United States isn't perfect, but relatively speaking, in all aspects of the world, what is the safest, most surest group that is likely to pay their debts? That would be the United States, and has been that way for over 225 years. But the Republicans in the House have decided to put that on the line, because they don't like the Affordable Care Act. Or they put all of that on the line because they don't like the way the budget process is working. They then doubled down and said, not only are we going to put the full faith and credit of the United States at risk, we're going to shut the government down while we do that until we get our way on a specific piece of legislation. Now, I know that there are principles underlining the Affordable Care Act that are worth debating. How big the size of government should be, how much the federal government should spend, how much local government should spend, what level of revenues and should be required to pay for it, and who should put up those revenues, in individuals or businesses. Those are important things to decide. We try to make those decisions every day. But for a group of 80 Republicans, 3 of whom are in my own state, sorry to say, 3 representatives signed a letter saying, if we don't get exactly what we want on the Affordable Care Act, which, by the way, passed the Congress, was upheld by the Supreme Court, and is being implemented in a majority of states, we are going to put the full faith and credit of the United States at risk. And literally, the ramifications of this are too massive to describe. So we have only a few days, maybe, I wouldn't even say we have a few days. We are already feeling the results of this hostage-taking by a few Republicans in the House of Representatives. And I am praying and hoping that my colleagues in the Senate will live up to the great hope of the Senate, which was at times like these to walk back from the ledge, reason together, and find a way forward. I see my good friend from Tennessee here, and I think if there's anyone that could help us do that, he would be one that could, and along with Senator McCain and Senator Graham and others who have been mayors, who have been elected officials for a long time, who understand how you can get wound up, and it's really important to calmly wind down and figure this out. And I'll yield in a minute to the senator if he has a question. But I do want to say, because my argument is not with him, that when senators come to the floor to say that Democrats haven't wanted to go along with the regular process, I want to again, because I came to the floor earlier, as an appropriator, I want to say that the first step in an appropriations process is to get a budget. Okay, and so the Democrats, amazingly, were able to get a budget. We haven't for 4 years in the Senate, so we got a budget. The Republicans got a budget, two completely different approaches to how the government should be funded, what should be spent, how much money should be raised, two different approaches. But you know what? It's two different parties. We have a Democratic Party controlling here, Republican Party controlling there. That's the first step. Two budgets, they're very different. We need to go to conference on that budget. But the Democrats here have asked our Republican colleagues that sit right across that aisle, please let us go to the Budget Committee 21 times. Now, I'm going to put this into the record. We started on April 23rd. Senator Reid requested unanimous consent. Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania objected. I'm not going to read them all. Let's fast forward to 5/14, May 14th. Senator Warner asked unanimous consent to go to conference. Senator McConnell blocked. Then go into June 4th. Senator Murray asked unanimous consent. Senator Rubio blocked. Then we say go to July 17th. Senator Murray asked again. Senator Mike Lee blocked. Now, they blocked going to budget because the Tea Partiers in this party, the small group of Republicans, said, we'll go to budget, but you can't talk about raising any revenues in budget. We'll go to a budget to try to solve the budget problems of the United States, but you Democrats cannot talk about raising revenues, because the only thing we want to talk about is cutting. Cutting, cutting, cutting. That's all. They'll cut anything. They'll cut Head Start. They'll cut education. They'll cut the EPA. I don't like the EPA very much myself, but that's all they want to do is cut. So we said you can't solve a problem with just one side of that equation. We don't know where the revenues might need to come from, but there's got to be a balance. And we have to start paying down our long-term debt. And that's one thing I want to say again. I don't want anyone in this government or world or my state or the nation to think that Democrats aren't concerned about the debt. We are concerned about the debt. We don't like the debt being this high. We want to try to find ways, and we have reduced with our Republican colleagues spending trillions of dollars. And the senator from Tennessee, to his credit, because I have not been in those negotiations, I was not part of the group of 8, but I've supported a lot of what they've done. I was not on the Simpson Bowls, but I've supported a lot of that. To his credit, he has really tried to come up with a grand bargain to get our country paying down our long-term debt, but in a smart way that strengthens our economy and does not pull the rug out from underneath it. But because the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz, through the chair, Senator Cruz from Texas, because Senator Lee from Utah said, no, we can't go to budget because, you know, unless you Democrats agree before you even get to the negotiating table that we can't raise any revenue. That's what the fight was about, so we never went to budget. So then when you don't go to the budget conference, then you can't start negotiating the individual bills. My responsibility is to negotiate Homeland. And I want to say I'm very proud of my colleague, Senator Coates. He and I were given a number by our leadership, and we have completely put our bill together with virtually no disagreement on a lower number than we had last year. We had to cut a lot of things out. And I might say we were asked by some Republican leaders to add a $700 million project that I had to absorb into my budget because of something that the Republicans asked for and the President supported. I want to be honest. I wasn't a big fan of it, but the President and the Republicans wanted it, so I had to compromise and put it in my bill without any additional money and take some things out to make room for it. That's what we do around here. That's what we used to do around here. We're not doing it much right now. So for anyone to come to the floor to try to say to Democrats, you know, you all aren't the ones that want to go to regular order, you all aren't the ones, we will go to budget. Patty Murray, the senator from Washington, could not be working any harder. She is one of the most respected members in this whole body, and I'm not just saying that. She's very humble. She's very smart. She is very much willing to negotiate, and Senator from Maryland, Senator Mikulski, is probably one of the most popular senators that's ever served in the Senate. Literally, everyone likes her. She's not difficult to work with. Now, she's tough. She's not difficult to work with. So we've got really two extraordinary people here trying to work through this. But yet, we're not really so much being blocked by our side on the Senate, even though they have blocked 21 times. They're being run by a group of extreme, radical party members on their side that have now gotten the Republican Party in complete disarray. That's not good for them, it's not really good for the Democrats, and it's definitely not good for the country. So now we have to figure out our way forward. And I know I've run into my 10 minutes. I don't know if the senator wants to speak or if he wants for me to yield to a question. I'm happy to just wrap this up and I'll speak in a minute. But to recap, I'm willing to be part of the common ground to find a solution. But I will not allow, as long as I'm on this floor today, and I'll be here for a couple of hours, for anyone to suggest that Democrats have been holding up the process. We've been trying to get to a budget committee for 6 months. We've been trying to negotiate appropriation bills. But we will not be held hostage, nor the people in the federal employees, or the businesses or nonprofits or our states and mayors and cities, because Republicans can't even go to the negotiation until they get 100% of their way, or until the government is shut down, it can't open, or until we default on our debt. We cannot negotiate under those terms. We can negotiate on terms where the hostages are freed and we sit down like grown-ups and work this out. I'm hoping we can do that. And I yield the floor, and I thank the senator for his patience.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I want to thank the senator from Louisiana for her desire to seek a solution, and appreciate the many ways we've been able to work together on so many issues. Look, I don't rise to blame either side right now. I don't. Let's face it, I've said from day one the effort that was taking place in the House regarding the health care bill was not an effort that was going to lead to a conclusion. It was an overreach. I know that. You know that. They know that. The country knows that. And so we have ended up where we are. But in fairness, what's happened over the last couple of days is, on the other side of the aisle has gotten one tick too cute, okay? We had a group of folks that had an idea. I thought it was a good starting place, candidly. We had 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats who had an idea of a way to move beyond this. And let's face it, we all know what happens around here. 2 nights ago, the White House weighed in and leadership on the Democratic side pulled back a hair, asked the 12 folks not to have a press conference yesterday to announce what their efforts were. And the fact is, we are where we are. Now, let me say this. I am perfectly happy with the 2 leaders negotiating a deal, and I want to support the leaders in negotiating a deal. I really am. But at the end of the day, what's happened, let's face it, is we've had a little bit of a pullback where House Republicans overreached, no question. What's also happened over the last couple of days is there's been a little bit of a push to overreach and undo what happened with the Budget Control Act back in 2011, where budget caps were put in place. The President signed it. It passed components of it. It passed the Senate. So it, just as much as a health care law is law, this also is law. And so what we've had over the last few days is a little bit of a pullback. I hope that it's temporary. But what I would say is, look, at this moment in time, we've actually had a little bit of problem on both sides. face it. And I think we got an opportunity over the next 24 hours for that to be worked out. And so what I would do is I would just encourage the leadership to continue on this pace. As we all know, it takes 4 days to move anything across the Senate floor. And I think we all know the debt ceiling is this Thursday. And so what I hope is going to happen is that both sides will admit, look, there's a little bit of an issue here on both sides. I think that there is a strong desire by the vast majority of our caucus over here to do something that is a pragmatic, good government step. At the end of the day, these events have always been used in times when you have tremendous concerns about where our financial situation, and they've always been used as a backstop to hopefully negotiate some reforms. Because we've been on the wrong page for so long, which I just admitted to, we've not even been in the right book, okay, but we've definitely been on the wrong page. We finally are on the right page, let's face it. As a matter of fact, we're not only on the right page finally, where we're focused on fiscal issues relative to a debt ceiling and relative to a continuing resolution to fund government. We're finally on fiscal solutions, and not only are we on the right page, we're finally on the right paragraph. I mean, we're focusing also on discussing mandatory reforms. Okay, so we're on the right subject. We got the two leaders that are now talking to each other. And by the way, I think the 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans that came together have helped that effort. Now, again, there was a little bit of a pullback when I do think the White House kind of encouraged, hey, let's see if there's some way we can bust the sequester. In fairness, I'm pretty sure that happened, and I think the senators in this chamber are pretty sure that happened. And, you know, I know there's been some concerns by some appropriators at the caps that exist. I understand that, but it is the law. And so what I hope will happen is we'll end up with an agreement. The time is so short, we're not going to really be able to do anything substantial on mandatory issues. I think we all know that. But I hope we'll end up with an agreement that at least sets the framework for us to move ahead, move this behind us, as we should, but sets the framework up to really move into dealing with the mandatory issues in such a way as they need to be dealt with. Look, I think it's unreasonable to ask people on our side of the aisle to have a $1 trillion debt ceiling increase and not put some kind of framework in place to look at some of the mandatory issues that we know are driving our country into the ground the way they are. I think there ought to be some framework for that to be discussed over the next 60, 90 days. I know the House has looked at 6 weeks. I know some people have said that's too short, but it seems to me doing something for the short term to get government up and the threat of the debt ceiling behind us, but doing something over the short term gives us some time to harness that energy that the senator from Louisiana was just alluding to. I know the presiding officer has intimated some of the same things. There's some energy in this body to deal with that. But the fact is we haven't. And a big part of it, as I've mentioned, has been we've been on the wrong subject for a long time. We're finally on the right one. Let's come to a place where we can now focus on the things we should have been focused on all along relative to debt ceilings and CRs. And I think the less we do here, and I don't think anybody that I've heard in recent times has been doing this, the less that we can do to sort of barb each other at this moment, because this is a moment where we really do need to resolve this issue. I mean, this is not a moment to take shots at each other. This is kind of the moment. We all know where we've been. We know the path we've been down. It's been winding. It's been in the wrong direction. We're now in the right place. Let's let these leaders work it out. And I hope that they will. And I hope that while the Democrats say this is settled law, the health care bill, the Affordable Care Act, I hope that Democrats will also say, and Republicans, I should have said Republicans on the last one, that the Budget Control Act is settled law. And we've agreed to some caps. There's a more intelligent way of getting to those caps, and I think there's probably 70 people in this body that agree, and that is we could do some mandatory reforms and substitute those for some of the discretionary cuts and still end up at the same levels of spending that are in this bill, and it will be more intelligent for our nation, and it would make our nation much stronger. And I think there's a lot of desire to talk about those kinds of things, done in the right way. There's all kinds of mandatory reforms. They're not the same. Another senator from Alabama who just came into the chamber made note of that yesterday. There's all kind of mandatory changes, and they're not the same. They're not equal, and we need to look at those. We need to honor the trusts that have been set up. But look, I think we finally have gotten to a pretty good place. I really do. And I think both sides are a little bit at fault. And, you know, people might discern one being more than the other. Now it's time for all of us to focus on the right page, the right paragraph, to get this done. And I think we can, as long as people don't try to, as the senator from Louisiana mentioned a minute ago, as long as people don't try to game this out into which gets a bigger win, which ends up with a political win. And I'm afraid a little of that stepped in over the last 24 hours. I hope it's going to dissipate, and I hope we're going to end up in a place that's good for our nation. That's what we all came here to do, and I think it's going to happen, although I will say I have been a little bit concerned because the last 24 hours, that has not been what these conversations have been about. So hopefully we'll get back on the page we were on about 36 hours ago and really focus on doing something that is bipartisan, that will stand the test of time, and we'll go over to the House in such a way that has a tremendous amount of support coming out of this chamber. And it's not something where, you know, one side tries to peel off 5 or 6 of the other side, and we end up, candidly, that's not going to stand the test of time. That's not going to take us to a place that solves this problem in time to keep the kind of things that the senator from Louisiana mentioned might happen if we don't. So my time is up in all likelihood, and I yield the floor for that reason.
Senator for Louisiana.